The ground is soft here, not from rain, but from memory. You press your foot into the moss, and it doesn't push back. As if the earth has learned to swallow without question, all around you. The stones lean inward. Not cut, not carved, just arranged. They form a shape, a ship, but there is no water. Only soil and silence. You don't know where you are exactly, not by map, but your body knows, your breath slows. Your shoulders drop, as if this place remembers what people forgot. The air smells like iron and old leaves. There is something buried here, many things, actually, but no one speaks of them aloud. The birds are quiet, the wind holds its tongue. Even the grass grows in a hush. Someone was laid here 1,000 years ago. Maybe a warrior, maybe a child, maybe both. No one really knows, because Viking burials weren't made to be understood. They were made to be felt, to be whispered about, to be feared. Some burned, some sailed, some vanished without fire, without stone, without name. And some, like this one, simply waited to be noticed again. There is no grave marker, only a pattern. Rocks like ribs, mounds like waves. You wouldn't see it unless you stepped back, but once you do, you realize you are standing inside a ship made of earth. Not every Viking was sent off on a boat. Some were burned in pits, others were buried in wagons. A few had their teeth dyed red. Some were buried with hawks, or slaves, or horses. One was buried with a door from her house. They didn't fear death. They built with it. They wrapped it in amber and iron. They carved dragons into it. They let it sail, or sink, or smolder. There are stories that never made it into the sagas. Stories only the ground remembers, like the man with no sword but 3 combs. Like the girl who was buried twice, like the empty grave filled with gifts. Tonight, you'll hear those stories, not the ones sung around fires, but the ones buried in ash, the ones carried in bones. You will walk through forests where funeral carts broke their wheels. You will pass fjords where flames once floated. You will see feathers, ash, teeth, runes no one can read. And through it all, you will not be alone. Because you are not just listening, you are standing there, beside the mound, holding something in your hand. A bowl, a feather, a story, and you won't know why. But you'll understand. So breathe in. Let the fog settle around you. The dead do not need answers, only that we remember. Only that we look again. Let us begin. There are graves waiting for us. Some still burning, some still dreaming, and some whispering your name. Section 1. The Myth of the Burning Ship. Close your eyes. Picture the scene. It's one you know well. One you've seen 100 times in movies and epic tales. A rocky fjord at dusk. The water black as obsidian. A Viking longship, elegant and fierce even in stillness, rests on the shore. On its deck, a fallen king lies on a bed of shields, his sword resting on his chest, his face turned towards a sky the color of bruises and embers. A torch is lit, it's handed to a grieving son, or perhaps a shield maiden with tears carving silent paths through the soot on her cheeks. The flame touches the ship's hull, which has been lovingly coated in pitch and oil. For a moment, there's only a whisper, a hiss. Then, with a deep whoosh, the fire catches, flames climb the mast, licking at the sail, turning wood and rope into a tower of roaring light. The ship is pushed out into the water. It drifts slowly, a floating pyre, a golden tear on the dark cheek of the sea, carrying the warrior's soul towards the gates of Valhalla. It's beautiful, it's noble, it's poetic. And for the most part, it's a fantasy. That powerful image, the one seared into our collective memory, is largely a product of 19th century Romanticism and 20th century cinema. While the Vikings had a profound connection to their ships and did indeed use them in their final rites, the idea of a flaming vessel sent drifting out to sea is incredibly rare in the archaeological record. So rare, in fact, that we have almost no definitive proof it was a common practice. It was likely too impractical, too uncertain. How could you ensure the fire consumed the body completely? How could you be sure the ship wouldn't just drift back to shore, a half-burnt, gruesome reminder of a failed farewell? The truth is something far more grounded, more intimate, and in its own way, more haunting. For a high-status Viking, a king, a queen, or a celebrated warrior, the ship was indeed their final vessel. But it wasn't a vessel for the sea, it was a vessel for the earth. Imagine this instead: the same longship, a marvel of clinker-built oak, is dragged ashore, not to be set alight, but to be buried. Think of the effort. Dozens of men, their muscles straining, pulling the immense weight of an ocean-going vessel over log rollers, moving it inland, away from the water it once commanded. The air doesn't smell of salt and sea spray, but of damp earth, sweat, and pine resin. The sounds aren't of crackling flames, but of groaning wood, chanting workers, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the ship settling into a trench dug just for it. The fallen leader is laid inside, not alone, but surrounded by their treasures. This is where the story gets real. They are buried with their swords, their shields, their finest jewelry, but also with their everyday things, their cooking pots, their weaving loom, their favorite game board, its pieces still in place, waiting for a final move. They believed you needed your belongings in the next life, that the journey was real and required provisions. And they didn't travel alone. Their prized horses, their loyal hunting dogs, were often sacrificed and laid beside them, eternal companions for a voyage into shadow. And in the darkest, most unsettling accounts, human servants were sacrificed as well, bound and killed to continue their service in the afterlife. Once the ship was filled with the body and its grave goods, it wasn't pushed into the water, it was buried, an entire ship, interred in the earth. A massive mound of soil, turf, and stone was piled over it, layer by layer, until the ship disappeared completely, sealed in darkness beneath a man-made hill. This was a hogger, a burial mound. It was a grave? Yes, but it was also a landmark, a permanent, unmoving declaration of power that could be seen for miles, anchoring a family's claim to the land for generations. So the goodbye wasn't a quick, fiery spectacle against the sunset. It was a slow, deliberate, and labor-intensive act of burial. It was a return to the earth, not a release to the sea. The ship, once a tool of exploration and conquest, became a womb in the cold soil, a silent ark waiting for a journey across the waves. But between worlds, this is where the real story begins, not in the myth of the burning ship, but in the cold, dark, and far more complex truth of the Viking grave. Because if we got that part wrong, what else have we misunderstood about their farewells? What did they truly believe about the soul? And where, exactly, did they think they were going? Tiet VG, Chung to S and Tip TICVV Ifan Tip Theo Ca Kutchben, K Lonwi Dung Cho Section 2. Tipne Kauchayan Viakuk Gi LS Chan CCTCA Gi Viking. Section 2. Not one soul, but many. So, the grand, fiery spectacle you imagined was a whisper, not a roar. The Viking goodbye was an earthly affair, a quiet return to the soil. But to understand why their farewells were so complex, so filled with strange objects and dark rituals, you first have to understand what they believed they were burying. It wasn't just a body, it was a collection of souls. In our modern world, we tend to think of the self as a single, unified thing. You have a body, and inside it, a mind, a spirit, a soul. It's simple, it's clean. But a Viking would have looked at you and seen something far more fragmented, a constellation of spirits living inside one human form. Imagine for a moment that you are not one person, but many. First, there is your hugr. This is your mind, your thoughts, your consciousness. It's the part of you that schemes, that remembers, that feels jealousy or pride. In the sagas, the hugr was a powerful force, something that could even leave the body during sleep to travel in dreams or scout ahead in the form of an animal. It was your intellect, your personality, the core of who you thought you were. When you died, Your Hugr needed a place to rest, to think, and perhaps to dream its final dreams. Then there is your hammer. This is your physical shape, your form, your skin and bones, but it was more than that. The hammer was the shape you presented to the world, and some powerful individuals were believed to have a hamingja, a kind of spiritual energy or luck that allowed them to shapeshift, to project their form into that of a wolf, a bear, or a bird. Your body wasn't just a vessel, it was a potent, magical shape, and when that shape was broken by death, it had to be honored and laid to rest with care. And watching over you, always, was your Filgia. This was your follower, a guardian spirit, often in the form of an animal, that was invisibly tied to you from birth. It was your spiritual double, your luck, your destiny. It might appear to you in a dream, just before a battle, or show itself to your loved ones at the moment of your death. When you were buried, your Filgia needed to be acknowledged, appeased, so it could either move on or continue to watch over your family line. This is why a Viking grave was never empty. It wasn't just a resting place for a body, it was an entire household for a collection of souls. The grave goods, the tools, the weapons, the jewelry, they weren't just for the physical you. Your Hugr might need its favorite game board to pass the time. Your hammer needed its fine clothes to maintain its dignity. And your ancestral spirit, the one passed down through your bloodline, needed the family sword to remain connected to its lineage. To bury a Viking was to settle a whole ecosystem of spiritual parts. Each piece of the soul had its own needs, its own journey. The grave was a nexus, a final home, where all these scattered parts could come to rest before beginning their next voyage. And that voyage wasn't always to the same destination. If the soul itself was so fragmented, could the afterlife be just as varied? Was Valhalla the only option for a warrior, and where did the farmer, the mother, or the Seeress go when their last breath faded into the winter air? The answer is far stranger than you think. Section 3. The Many Halls of the Afterlife. You've heard the name, whispered in legends and shouted in battle cries, Valhalla, the great golden hall of Odin, where the ceilings are thatched with shields, the rafters are made of spears, and the benches are filled with the spirits of the bravest warriors, a place of endless feasts, where mead flows from the udders of a cosmic goat and a great boar is cooked and resurrected each night. A paradise where you fight all day in glorious combat, die, and are reborn by sunset, ready for another night of drinking and song. It's a magnificent story. But what if I told you that for a Viking warrior, getting into Valhalla was like winning a divine lottery, and that most didn't make the cut? The journey after death for a Viking wasn't a single path. It was a branching river, flowing into many different seas, some shimmering, some shrouded in mist. Valhalla was only one of them, and it was exclusive. It was a military barracks for the end times. Odin wasn't hosting a party. He was recruiting an army for Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods. Only the most courageous warriors, those who died with a weapon in their hand, were even considered. And even then, Odin only got to choose half of them. The other half belonged to a different ruler, a goddess. Before the Valkyries descended to claim souls for Odin, the goddess Freya had the first choice. She was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and of a powerful form of magic known as Seer, but she was also a goddess of war, and she would take her pick of the slain to live with her in her own afterlife realm, a beautiful, peaceful meadow known as Folkvanger, the field of the people. We don't know much about life in Folkvanger, but it was considered just as honorable as Valhalla, if not more serene, a place of green fields rather than bloody training grounds, a hall ruled by a powerful goddess, not a one-eyed god preparing for doomsday. But what about everyone else? What about the farmer who died in his sleep, the mother who died in childbirth, the old skald whose last breath was a forgotten verse? They did not go to Valhalla or Folkvanger. For the vast majority of Vikings, the journey ended in a realm called Hell, or Helheim. Don't let the name fool you. This wasn't the Christian hell of fire and torment. It was something far more psychologically chilling. A cold, damp, misty underworld ruled by the goddess Hel, Loki's daughter. It was a place of shadows, of quiet, of endless twilight, a gray reflection of the living world, where the dead walked in a silent, joyless existence. It wasn't a punishment, it was simply an end. A slow fading into nothingness, and yet, there was another option, one that didn't require crossing any spiritual river at all. Some Vikings believed that the dead didn't leave, or at least, a part of their soul remained right here. On Earth, they believed the dead lived on inside their burial mounds. The Draugr was not a tomb, it was a home. The spirit of the ancestor, the Kinfilja, stayed with the land, watching over the family, offering blessings if pleased, or curses if disturbed. This is why graves were treated with such reverence and fear. The dead were not gone, they were just next door, sleeping beneath a hill of earth and stone. So the Viking goodbye wasn't a ticket to one destination, but a departure into a complex spiritual geography with many possible shores. But how did a Viking's life their status, their deeds, their wealth, determine which path their soul would take? For most, the journey began not with a golden ticket to Valhalla, but with a simple hole in the cold, hard earth. Section 4. The Humble Grave, a Peasant's Rest. But you are not a king. You are not a famous jarl, or a shield maiden whose deeds are sung in the great halls. You are a farmer. Your hands are calloused from the plow, not the sword. Your face is lined by the sun and the wind, not by the politics of court. You lived your life by the rhythm of the seasons, by the turning of the earth, and when your time comes, your farewell is just as grounded, just as quiet. There is no longship waiting on the shore for you, no great pyre that lights up the night sky. Your goodbye is an intimate affair, handled not by priests in grand robes, but by the hands of your own family. Your body is washed one last time, with cold water drawn from the familiar well. They dress you in your finest tunic, the one you wore to the midwinter feast. It's not silk or embroidered with gold, but it's clean, mended, and it smells of home, of wood smoke and dried herbs. Your children's hands, small and hesitant, comb your hair. Your spouse whispers a final word, a private prayer meant only for you and the gathering shadows. Your grave is not a grand statement. It's a simple pit, dug into the earth on your own land, perhaps on a small hill overlooking the fields you worked your entire life. From here, you can forever watch over the barley swaying in the wind. Sometimes, you are laid directly into the earth, a bed of flat stones placed beneath you to keep you from the damp soil. Your family places a few things with you, not treasures, but tools for the journey ahead. The small iron knife you always carried at your belt, a whetstone to keep it sharp, an intricate bone comb, a small personal vanity, a clay pot filled with a bit of bread and dried meat, a final meal for the road. These objects aren't for show, they are for use. They are a reflection of the life you lived, a life of quiet labor and simple needs. The grave is filled, the earth is patted down, and perhaps a single, tall, uncut stone is raised to mark the spot, a bautastine, no runes, no carvings, just a silent finger pointing towards the sky, a quiet anchor for memory. Other times, the farewell is through fire. Not a roaring ship, but a humble pyre built of logs from the nearby forest. Your body is burned, and as the flames die down, your family carefully gathers the ashes and fragments of bone. They are placed inside a ceramic urn, still warm to the touch. This urn is then buried, perhaps with a single melted glass bead or a twisted metal brooch, the only things that survive the heat. This was the goodbye for the 99%. It wasn't about glory or legend. It was about family, about the land, and about a deep, abiding respect for the cycles of life and death. It was a ritual rooted in the simple, profound hope that you would find peace in the quiet mists of Helheim, or perhaps that some part of you would remain here, in the mound, forever watching over the farm, a silent guardian in the soil. But for the powerful 1%, for the chieftains, the queens, the wealthy traders, their graves were not just holes in the ground, They were treasure chests, packed for a very different kind of eternity. And what they chose to pack tells us everything about the lives they lived and the power they refused to let go of, even in death. Section 5. Packing for the Afterlife, the Grave Goods. Imagine preparing for the longest journey you will ever take. A voyage not across the sea, but across the stars, into the mists of the afterlife. You wouldn't go empty-handed, would you? The Vikings certainly didn't. To them, the next world was not some ethereal, spiritual plane. It was a physical place, a place where you would need your tools, your comforts, your weapons, and your wealth. A grave wasn't an endpoint. It was a departure lounge, and you had to pack accordingly. For a warrior, the packing list was simple and brutal. First, the sword. It was more than a weapon. It was a part of his identity, often with a name and a history of its own. In many graves, archaeologists find swords that have been deliberately bent or broken. This wasn't disrespect. This was a ritual act of killing the sword, releasing its spirit so it could travel with its master. His spear would be laid beside him, his axe at his feet, and his shield often placed over his chest, a final act of defense. But it wasn't only warriors who packed for the journey. A blacksmith was buried with his favorite hammer and tongs, the tools that defined his life's work. A trader was sent off with his bronze scales and a small pouch of silver weights, ready to do business in the halls of the dead. Even a humble farmer might be buried with a sickle, a silent testament to a life spent working the land. Your profession in life was your profession in death. And what about leisure? The afterlife wasn't all work and battle. In many graves, we find game boards, most famously for a game called Nefertov, a strategic board game similar to chess. Carved pieces made of whalebone or polished stone are found carefully arranged, as if waiting for the game to resume. They buried their dice, their drinking horns, their wooden buckets and iron cauldrons. They believed you would hunger, thirst, and grow bored in the next world, just as you did in this one. For the wealthy, the grave became a final, breathtaking display of status. They were buried with treasures from a world away. Shimmering glassware from the Rhineland, delicate silks from Constantinople, silver dirham coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, melted down and reshaped into arm rings. These weren't just decorations. They were proof of a life lived on a global stage. A final boast of worldly success. Women of high status were laid to rest, with their jewelry intricate brooches to fasten their cloaks, necklaces of amber and carnelian, and rings of twisted silver. And among all these worldly things, there were whispers of magic. Small amulets were tucked into clothing. A Thor's hammer pendant for protection, a carved animal for strength, a small pouch of mysterious herbs. These were not for comfort. They were for protection on the treacherous road ahead. They packed for a life they fully expected to continue, with all its needs, its comforts, its work, and its dangers. They filled their graves with the story of who they were. But sometimes, the most valuable grave good wasn't an object you could hold. It was a companion, breathing and warm. And the story of how they brought those companions with them is where the Viking farewell takes its darkest, most chilling turn. Section 6. A chilling companion. Ritual sacrifice. A sword is a loyal companion. A drinking horn holds memories of feasts and laughter. A fine cloak can offer warmth against the biting winds of the underworld. But for some Viking elites, for the jarls and kings whose power on earth was absolute, these silent objects were not enough. The journey to the afterlife was long, dark, and lonely. It required more than just tools. It required loyalty. It required life. In the most powerful Viking graves, we find more than just artifacts. We find bones that do not belong to the master of the tomb. The most common are animals, a chieftain's favorite horse, its head carefully severed and placed at his feet, ready to be ridden again on the plains of the next world. His hunting dogs, their bodies curled as if in sleep, laid beside him to chase phantom stags through misty forests. His falcons, their wings folded, ready to soar once more at his command. This wasn't an act of cruelty in their eyes. It was an act of profound respect. A warrior was nothing without his horse. A hunter was lost without his hounds. To send them with him was to ensure he arrived in the afterlife not as a diminished spirit, but as the great man he was in life, with his full retinue, his full identity intact. The sacrifice was a continuation of a bond that death could not break. But the silence in these graves sometimes tells a darker story. A story that history often whispers instead of shouts. Sometimes, the companions weren't animals. They were human. Imagine this: you are a thrall, a slave, captured in a raid from a foreign land years ago. Your life has never been your own. It belongs to your master, and now, he has died. While his family grieves, a different kind of fate is decided for you. You are chosen to accompany him. They call it an honor, a chance to serve a great man in the halls of the gods. But you know what it is. Archaeologists find these silent companions in the earth, skeletons of young men and women, often found at the edges of a main burial, sometimes in contorted positions, sometimes with signs of a violent end. They were the servants, the farm hands, the stable boys. Their lives were considered part of their master's wealth, and in his death, that wealth was sent with him. And in the most powerful farewells, the sacrifice was even more intimate. A wife, or a concubine. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, in a terrifying eyewitness account, described how a slave girl volunteered to die with her master. For days, she was treated like a queen, dressed in fine silks, given intoxicating drinks, and passed from man to man in a series of dark rituals. She sang, they said, but was her song one of joy or of terror? In the end, she was sacrificed, her life given to ensure her master would not be lonely on his final voyage. Was it a choice? Or was it an obligation so deeply woven into the fabric of their society that refusal was unthinkable? We will never know. What we do know is that these chilling companions, both animal and human, tell us that the Viking goodbye was not always a peaceful one. It was sometimes an act of brutal, terrifying devotion, a testament to a world where power on earth demanded to be mirrored in the afterlife, no matter the cost. But no farewell was more iconic, more filled with symbolism and power, than the one that took place upon a ship, a vessel not just for the sea, but for the soul itself. Section 7. The Ship Burial, a Vessel for the Soul. To understand the Viking Age is to understand the ship. It wasn't just a vessel of wood and iron rivets, held together with tar and wool. It was a living thing, a dragon of the waves, a serpent of the sea. It was the key that unlocked the world for a people tucked away in the cold, northern fjords. Imagine your entire life revolving around this vessel. It's the source of your wealth, carrying you to the glittering markets of Constantinople to trade furs for silk and silver. It's the instrument of your power, carrying your war band to the shores of England to claim glory and land. It's your freedom, the only thing that allows you to leave the familiar behind and touch the unknown. The ship is your home, your fortress, and your legacy. So, when your life ends, what better vessel to carry your soul on its final voyage? The ship burial was the ultimate farewell, a ritual reserved for the most powerful, the most revered, and the wealthiest members of society. Kings, queens, and legendary chieftains. To be buried in a ship was the highest honor, a statement of power that would echo for generations. Because to bury a ship was to bury a fortune. It was to take a priceless engine of war and commerce out of the world of the living and commit it to the realm of the dead. It was the most extravagant sacrifice one could make. This wasn't just about status, it was a deep-seated spiritual belief. The Vikings saw the universe as interconnected by cosmic waters. Midgard, the realm of humans, was separated from Asgard, the home of the gods, and Helheim, the land of the dead, by vast, mystical seas. Only a ship could navigate these waters. The grave ship, or skipgrave, was a literal vehicle for the afterlife, equipped to carry the soul across the threshold between worlds. In their mythology, the dead sailed. The great ship Naglfar, built from the uncut fingernails and toenails of the dead, was prophesied to break free during Ragnarok, carrying an army of giants to the final battle. The dead needed ships, a proper burial ensured you had one. And we know these weren't just stories. The sagas told of great leaders being laid to rest in their longships, and for centuries, people thought it was only myth. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists in Norway began to unearth them. The Gokstad ship, the Tun ship, and most magnificent of all, the Oseberg ship, perfectly preserved burial mounds held entire Viking longships within their earthy wombs, their timbers still intact after 1,000 years of silence. They were filled with treasures. Yes, but the ship itself was the greatest treasure of all. But to commit such a treasure to the next world was a complex affair. It wasn't always a blaze of glory on the open water. The Vikings had the very different ways of sending off their ships of the dead, one of fire, and one of earth. And each tells a different story about their final voyage. Section 8. Fire and Earth, Two Kinds of Ship Funerals. The final journey in a Viking ship, the most esteemed farewell a mortal could receive, could take one of two forms, each with its own poetry, its own terror, and its own deep, resonant meaning. One was a goodbye of fire and sea, a spectacular release to the heavens. The other was a quiet, eternal return to earth and darkness. First, imagine the path of fire. This is the version that haunts our imagination, the one sung about in the sagas. The longship is prepared on the shore, its proud dragon prow pointed towards the open water. It is filled not just with treasures, but with kindling, with pitch, with everything needed to turn a vessel of war into a vessel of flame. The body of the chieftain is laid upon a bed of furs and shields. The torch is lit, the fire catches with a deep, hungry roar. Flames race up the mast, and the sail becomes a sheet of fire against the dying sun. The ship is pushed from the shore, a floating pyre drifting slowly out into the cold, black water. For those watching, it's a breathtaking, final performance of power. The smoke carries the soul upwards, a dark column connecting the world of the living to the realm of the gods. The body, the ship, the treasures all are consumed, purified, and released from the earthly realm. It is a clean break, a definitive end. A soul set free on the wind, but there was another way. A quieter, heavier, and perhaps even more powerful farewell. The path of earth. Imagine now that same longship, but instead of being pushed out to sea, it is dragged inland. The sound is not of crackling fire, but of groaning timber and the straining muscles of men. The ship is settled into a deep trench, a grave carved in the shape of its hull. The chieftain is laid inside, surrounded by his otherworldly provisions, his horse, his weapons, his feasting gear. But there is no fire. Instead, there is silence. And then comes the earth, shovel by shovel, stone by stone. A great mound is built over the ship. The sunlight is slowly blocked out. The proud mast disappears beneath layers of turf and clay. The world outside grows muffled, distant. The ship is not released. It is encased, sealed in a dark, silent womb of soil. This is not a journey away from the world, it is a journey into it. The two farewells could not be more different. One is a public spectacle of release and transformation. The other is a private, eternal stillness. The fire ship sends the soul soaring to the heavens. The earth ship anchors the soul to the land, turning the deceased into a powerful ancestor, a guardian spirit dwelling within their own man-made mountain. One about letting go, the other is about holding on forever. So, which would a Viking choose? A swift departure on a column of smoke, a soul vanishing into the sky? Or an eternal sleep in the dark, silent hull of their ship, forever bound to the soil they once ruled? Whether by fire or by earth, the goodbye was monumental. But for those buried in the earth, the grave itself became something more than a tomb. It became a living mountain, a landmark of power visible for generations to come, a place where the dead were never truly gone. Section 9. The Living Mountain, the Power of the Burial Mound. The ship is sealed in darkness. The farewell is done. But the grave is not forgotten. In fact, its story is just beginning, because for the Vikings, the mound of earth piled high over their elite dead was not just a marker. It was a new kind of mountain, a living mountain, pulsing with memory, power, and the spirits of the ancestors. This was the Draugr, a man-made hill, often built in the most prominent spot in the landscape on a ridge overlooking the fjord, near the family farmstead, or visible to any ship sailing past. This was not a humble grave. It was a political statement carved into the horizon. Imagine you are a traveler, sailing your longship into an unfamiliar fjord. As you round a bend, you see them, not one, but a dozen of these silent, green hills dotting the coastline, their shapes perfectly symmetrical against the gray sky. You would know instantly which family held power here. Each mound was a declaration of lineage, a permanent anchor of ownership. It said, "This land is ours, our fathers are buried here, our grandfathers are watching, and they do not welcome strangers." But the mound was more than a symbol, it was a home. The Vikings believed that the dead, or at least a powerful part of their soul, continued to exist inside the Draugr. The buried ship was their hall, the treasures their furniture, the sacrificed animals their eternal companions. The deceased became a hog buoy, a mound dweller. They weren't truly gone, they were just living next door, in a house made of earth and silence. This belief created a strange and powerful relationship between the living and the dead. The family mound was a place of reverence. People might come to sit on the mound, to speak to their ancestors, to ask for wisdom or blessings for a good harvest. It was a place to connect with the family's spiritual power, the kinfilja that flowed through their bloodline. But these places were also feared. A mound dweller could be a benevolent guardian, but it could also become a malevolent Draugr, a terrifying undead creature that would rise from the grave to terrorize the living. At night, people spoke of seeing a strange, bluish light flickering over the mounds. They called it hog elder, or mound fire, a ghostly flame that was said to guard the treasure within. And there was always treasure, gold, silver, and masterfully crafted weapons were buried there, protected not by locks, but by the fierce spirit of the mound dweller itself. These living mountains dotted the Scandinavian landscape, each one a silent kingdom for the dead, a center of power and fear. They were monuments, not just to a person's life, but to their enduring presence after death. But not all who were buried with such honor were kings or warriors. Some of the most powerful mounds held a different kind of ruler, a woman of magic, a Seeress, whose grave goods tell a story not of battle, but of prophecy, secrets, and the hidden currents of fate. Section 10. The Seeress's Tomb, a Grave of Magic. Not all power in the Viking world was held by men with swords and scarred knuckles. Some of the deepest respect, and the deepest fear, was reserved for a woman who wielded a different kind of weapon, vision. She was the Volva, the Seeress, the staff carrier, the walker between worlds. She practiced a powerful and dangerous form of Norse magic known as seer. She could gaze into the swirling mists of fate, communicate with the spirits of the dead, cast spells to protect a village, or curse an enemy army. Kings and chieftains would summon her for counsel before a great battle, and common farmers would beg her for a charm to ensure a good harvest. She lived on the edges of society, yet she stood at the very center of its spiritual life. So when a woman of such power died, her farewell was unlike any other. Her grave was not filled with the tools of war, but with the instruments of magic. Imagine you are an archaeologist, brushing away 1,000 years of soil from a forgotten grave. You don't find the familiar shape of a sword or an axe. Instead, your brush reveals a long, slender iron staff, sometimes with a bronze basket-like ornament at the top. This is a staffer, a magic staff or distaff. It was the primary symbol of the Vivivis power, an antenna to the spirit world, used to channel energy and enter a trance state. It was her scepter, her wand, her connection to the unseen. Beside her, you find a small leather pouch, tied shut. It looks unassuming, but inside, it holds her secrets. You carefully open it and find not coins or jewels, but a collection of strange and potent objects. The small bones of an owl, a raven's claw, polished stones that seem to hum with a faint energy, and most telling of all, a cluster of tiny, black seeds. These are henbane seeds. When thrown onto hot coals, they release a thick, hallucinogenic smoke. The vulva would have breathed this in during her rituals, allowing her mind to break free from the physical world and travel into the realm of visions. This wasn't just a grave, it was a shaman's toolkit, packed for a journey into a very different kind of afterlife. She is buried in a fine blue dress, a color associated with magic and death. A grand headdress might adorn her skull, and a magnificent chariot might have been her coffin. Her grave is one of wealth, of status, of profound importance. In a Viking Age grave found in Firecat, Denmark, such a woman was discovered, laid to rest with her iron staff, her pouch of secrets, and all the regalia of her otherworldly office. Her burial tells us something vital about the Viking world. They didn't just honor the power that could conquer land. They honored the power that could see beyond it, and very often, that power was female. The Viva's grave is a silent testament to a different kind of authority, one that didn't need a sword to command the respect of kings, but a whisper that could shape the destiny of the gods themselves. The Seeress was laid to rest with the tools of her otherworldly trade. But she was not the only woman of power in the Viking world. Even those who did not weave spells held a different kind of authority, one symbolized not by a magic staff, but by a simple set of keys. Section 11. A Queen's Farewell. The Woman with the Keys. But magic was not the only source of female power in the north. In the world of the Vikings, the longhouse was a kingdom unto itself, and its undisputed queen was the woman who held the keys. She was the Hesfreya, the mistress of the house, and her authority, while different from a warrior's, was no less absolute. While her husband was away for months, sometimes years, on raiding expeditions or treacherous trade voyages, she ruled. She managed the farm, oversaw the servants and thralls, controlled the food stores, and handled the family's finances. She was the anchor, the steady center in a world of chaos and uncertainty. Her power wasn't granted by a king. It was earned through competence, wisdom, and the tireless work of her own hands. And when she died, her burial reflected this quiet, domestic sovereignty. Her grave is not filled with swords or shields. Instead, archaeologists find a different set of treasures. The most important among them is a simple object, often made of bronze or iron, that symbolizes her entire domain, a set of keys. In life, she would have worn these keys proudly at her waist, a visible sign of her authority. They unlocked the chests that held the family's wealth, the food stores that kept the village from starving through the long winter, and the precious linens woven for trade. To be buried with her keys meant that she would continue her role as the guardian of the household in the next world. Beside the keys, we find the tools of her trade, a weaving sword, a long, flat piece of wood or whalebone used to beat the threads tight on a loom. Spindle whorls made of stone or clay, used for spinning wool into yarn. Fine needles and ornate scissors. To a Viking woman, weaving wasn't a hobby, it was a highly respected art form, a way to create wealth and beauty. The cloth she made was as valuable as a warrior's silver. Her tools were her weapons of creation. We find other echoes of her life's work: small iron knives for preparing food, a cauldron for the hearth, and sometimes even a wooden chair or a small stool, suggesting she would continue to preside over her otherworldly home. Her grave was not a tomb. It was a longhouse in miniature, fully furnished for her to resume her duties, and of course, there is jewelry, not just for beauty, but as a sign of her success. High-status women were often buried with magnificent oval brooches that fastened their dresses, intricate necklaces of amber, jet, and imported glass beads, and silver rings on their fingers. This wasn't just vanity. It was a display of the family's prosperity, a prosperity that she herself had managed and maintained. Imagine being this woman. Your world is the longhouse. Your battlefield is the budget for the winter stores. Your crown is the ring of keys that jingles softly at your waist. You don't conquer foreign lands, you build and sustain your own. And in your death, you are honored not as a warrior, but as something even more vital, the heart of the home. Her grave was not a tomb, but a fully furnished world, ready for her to resume her duties. But what if we could see not just the objects, but the ritual itself? What if we had an eyewitness, someone from a world away who stood and watched a Viking chief's funeral, and wrote down every single, terrifying detail? Fortunately for history, such a man existed. Section 12. An Outsider's Eye, Ibn Fadlan's terrifying account. The stories of Viking farewells, passed down through sagas and reconstructed from bone and rust, often feel like myths, distant, hazy, open to interpretation. But what if someone had been there? What if a traveler from a completely different world had stood on the river bank, watched the entire ritual unfold, and wrote it all down? In the 10th century, such a man existed. His name was Ahmad ibn Fadlan. He was a sophisticated, educated Arab diplomat, a man of law and faith, sent from the glittering city of Baghdad on a mission to the north. On his journey along the Volga River, he encountered a group of Viking traders they called the Rus. He was fascinated and horrified by them. He saw them as perfect physical specimens, tall as date palms, but also as the filthiest of God's creatures. And then he witnessed one of them die, a great chieftain. What Ibn Fadlan recorded next is one of the most precious and chilling eyewitness accounts in all of history. He tells us that, when the chieftain died, his body was placed in a temporary grave for 10 days. During this time, his thralls, his slaves, were asked a question: "Who among you will die with him?" One slave girl raised her hand. She volunteered. From that moment on, her fate was sealed. For the next 10 days, while the chieftain's family prepared his ship for its final voyage, this girl was treated like a queen. She was dressed in the finest silks, adorned with jewels, and given strong drink day and night. She sang, she feasted, and she was attended to by other girls who never left her side. She was an offering being prepared, a living soul being polished for sacrifice. On the day of the funeral, the chieftain's longship was pulled onto the shore and placed upon a pyre of wood. A silk-draped pavilion was built upon its deck. They brought the chieftain from his temporary grave, dressed him in priceless brocades with gold buttons, and sat him upon a mattress inside the pavilion, propped up with cushions. Around him, they placed his weapons. They brought bread, meat, and onions. They brought a dog, which they cut into and threw into the ship. They brought the horses, which they forced to run until they sweated, then hacked to pieces. Finally, they brought the oxen, which were also killed and added to the pyre. The ship was now a feast for the dead. Then came the girl. She was given more drink. She sang her final songs, saying goodbye to her friends and her world. She was then led to the ship, where she was met by an old, imposing woman known as the Angel of Death. The girl was lifted into the pavilion. Inside, men began to beat their shields with sticks, a rhythmic, deafening thunder, perhaps to drown out her cries. Ibn Fadlan writes that she was then killed, a ritualistic end with both a dagger and a rope. Her life was given to her master, a final act of service. Then, the closest male relative of the chieftain, naked, walked backwards towards the ship. Holding a single torch, he lit the pyre. One by one, others came forward with their own torches, and soon the entire ship was engulfed in a ferocious blaze. A strong wind rose, carrying the smoke and, the Vikings believed, the souls of the chieftain and the girl, swiftly to paradise. Ibn Fadlan watched, a man of books and mosques, as this wild, terrifying, and deeply sacred farewell unfolded. He saw not just barbarism, but a devotion so absolute it defied his understanding. His account is a chilling, invaluable window into a world we can barely imagine. It confirms the darkest whispers about Viking ritual, but it also raises a question: what were the Vikings so afraid of that would make such rituals necessary? They weren't just honoring the dead, they were making sure the dead stayed dead. Section 13. The Fear of the Walking Dead, the Draugr. The Viking farewell, with all its treasures, its ships, and its sacrifices, was an act of honor, a way to ensure the dead had everything they needed for the next world. But beneath all that reverence, there was another, colder emotion at play: fear. Fear not of death itself, but of what came after. Fear of the dead who simply refused to stay dead. In the long, dark Scandinavian nights, families would gather around the fire and whisper stories of the Draugr. This wasn't a mindless zombie or a harmless ghost. The Draugr was the animated corpse of the deceased, a terrifying creature that retained its memories, its personality, and all of its earthly malevolence. They were said to be supernaturally strong, able to swell to enormous sizes, and their skin was often black or deathly pale. Their eyes, some stories say, glowed with a cold, hateful light. Not everyone became a Draugr. It was a fate reserved for the worst of humanity, the greedy, the cruel, the powerful chieftains who loved their worldly treasures too much to let go. Their sheer force of will was so strong that it anchored them to their decaying bodies, refusing to let the soul move on. The Draugr was driven by a single, venomous emotion, a bitter envy of the living. It would rise from its burial mound at night. It didn't just wander aimlessly, it would haunt its old farmstead, its heavy footsteps heard on the roof, crushing the timbers. It would kill livestock, sit on the chests of sleeping mortals until they suffocated, and attack anyone who dared to approach its grave to reclaim the treasure buried within. This terror of the restless dead profoundly shaped how the Vikings buried their most troublesome members. The grave wasn't just a home for the dead. Sometimes, it had to be a prison. If a particularly nasty person died, the family took precautions. Sometimes, a special hole was broken in the wall of the longhouse to carry the body out. This corpse door was then immediately sealed up, the belief being that the spirit could only re-enter the way it left, and now it would be confused, unable to find its way back inside. The body itself might be prepared to prevent it from walking. The big toes were sometimes tied together. In some accounts, sharp needles were pushed through the soles of the feet. Or a sickle was placed on the corpse's chest, a symbolic weapon to keep it pinned to the earth. If a Draugr did begin to walk and terrorize a village, the only way to stop it was for a great hero to face it in physical combat. The hero had to wrestle the creature back into its tomb, cut off its head, place the head by the corpse's thighs, and then burn the entire body to ash. Only then could its malevolent spirit be truly destroyed. This fear also explains why some burial mounds were built far away from the village, in remote valleys or on desolate coastlines. It was a form of spiritual quarantine. If this person was likely to rise again, it was better to have them do it far from the world of the living. This terror of the undead shaped how the Vikings buried their dead. It was a goodbye layered with caution, a farewell wrapped in fear. They built graves not just as homes for the dead, but sometimes as prisons. And some of these prisons were as elaborate and as carefully furnished as any longhouse. Section 14. A room for the afterlife, the chamber tombs. But not every mound was a prison built of fear. For the most revered chieftains, the most beloved queens, the home within the hill was no simple pit in the earth. It was a carefully constructed room, a house for eternity, a chamber tomb designed to be a palace for the soul. Imagine standing at the bottom of a deep, square pit, the scent of damp earth thick in the air. Around you, carpenters are fitting together heavy oak beams, their hammers echoing softly in the enclosed space. They are building the walls and roof of a small, windowless house. This is not a coffin they are building for you. This is your bedroom for the next world. This was the chamber tomb, an elaborate, subterranean hall where the powerful dead were meant to live on, not just as spirits, but as rulers presiding over their court of shadows. When the room was finished, you would be brought inside. You would not be laid flat, as if in sleep. No, you would be seated upright on a wooden chair, perhaps your favorite one from your longhouse, placed in the center of the room. You are the master of this new hall, and you will greet the afterlife from your throne. Your grave goods are arranged around you not as a simple pile, but as if your home has been moved underground. Your sword is hung from a wooden peg on the wall. Your shield rests beside your chair. A drinking horn is placed on a small table, next to a game of Nefertov with the pieces set. As if waiting for an opponent, your sacrifice companions are here too. Your loyal horse stands in a corner, saddled and ready. Your hunting dogs lie at your feet, and sometimes a sacrifice thrall is seated on a stool near the entrance, forever the guardian of your final door. This is not a burial. This is a scene, a tableau frozen in time, an eternal living room for the dead. Once everything is in place, the roof is sealed with heavy timbers. And then the earth comes, tons of it, mixed with stones, piled on top until your subterranean house is buried deep beneath a new mountain. The last sliver of light disappears, and you are left in a perfect, profound, and eternal silence. This was an incredible act of devotion and a tremendous expense of resources. To build a house that no living eye would ever see again was the ultimate display of status and belief. It confirmed, in the clearest possible way, the Viking conviction that life did not end at death. It simply moved to a different address. These subterranean halls were palaces for the dead, waiting for a life that was meant to continue in the shadows. But, as the centuries wore on, a new belief began to drift across the north from the south, a belief in a single God, a single, indivisible soul, and a single, very different kind of grave. The age of the chamber tomb, with all its worldly comforts, was slowly coming to an end. Section 15. When the old gods died, the Christian conversion. For centuries, the old gods had ruled the spiritual landscape of the north. Odin, the All-Father, who welcomed warriors to his hall, Thor, with his mighty hammer, who brought thunder and protected humankind. Freya, the goddess of love and magic, their presence was felt in the rustle of leaves, the crash of waves, and the crackle of the hearth fire. But a new god was arriving. A quiet, patient god from the south, carried on the tongues of monks, merchants, and kings who saw a different kind of power. And as this new faith, Christianity, took root in the Scandinavian soil, it didn't just change how the Vikings lived. It profoundly changed how they died. The shift was not sudden. It was a slow tide, creeping into the fjords over generations. But it brought with it a completely new map of the afterlife, and a new set of rules for the final journey. The first and greatest change was the end of fire. The Christian faith taught that the body was a sacred vessel, created in God's image. It was not to be burned, but to be preserved, kept whole for a final resurrection on Judgment Day. And so, the funeral pyres that once lit up the northern sky began to die out. Cremation became a pagan act, a thing of the past. The goodbye was no longer a release into smoke and air, but a return to the earth, to wait. With this new belief, the grave goods vanished. The new god did not require a warrior to arrive with his sword, a woman with her keys, or a chieftain with his horse. Worldly wealth was meaningless in the kingdom of heaven. In fact, it was a hindrance. A rich man, the priest said, had as much chance of entering heaven as a camel passing through the eye of a needle. So the treasures stayed above ground. The swords were passed down to sons. The jewelry was given to the church. The graves became empty, simple, quiet. Imagine it. Your final resting place is no longer a fully furnished house for eternity. You are wrapped in a simple linen shroud. No tools, no food, no companions, just you, your body, and your faith. And the location of the grave changed too. You are no longer buried on your family's land, in a great mound that declared your lineage. Instead, you are brought to consecrated ground, a churchyard, a cemetery. You were laid to rest among your neighbors, your community, all equal in the eyes of the new god. The focus shifted from the power of the clan to the unity of the congregation. Even the way you were placed in the earth was now prescribed. Every grave was oriented on an east-west axis, your head to the west, your feet to the east, so that when the final trumpet sounded, you would rise up to face Christ, who was expected to return from the east. It was a precise, symbolic act that replaced the varied and personal arrangements of the old ways. But this transition was slow, and sometimes uncertain. Archaeologists have found fascinating transitional graves. A man buried in a perfect east-west orientation, like a good Christian, but with his favorite sword laid beside him, just in case. A woman buried with a cross around her neck, but with a small, hidden Thor's hammer amulet tucked in her pouch. It was a time of hedging baits, of honoring both the old world and the new, a quiet testament to a people caught between two afterlives. The great mounds were no longer raised, the ships were no longer buried. The Viking goodbye became quieter, more uniform, more final. But even as the Vikings adopted this new faith, did the old ways vanish completely, or did they linger? Some graves, even older ones, were not left to rest in peace. They were opened, but not always by Christian priests or rival kings. Sometimes, they were opened by the Vikings themselves. Section 16. Reopening the ancient graves, robbery, or ritual. You would think that a grave, especially the sacred mound of a powerful ancestor, would be a place of eternal rest, a place to be feared, respected, and left untouched forever. To disturb the dead was to invite the wrath of spirits, to risk a curse on your entire bloodline. But in the Viking world, some of the most famous graves were not left in peace. They were opened. And the ones holding the shovels, the ones digging into the silent earth, weren't always looters from a foreign land. They were often the Vikings themselves. Archaeologists across Scandinavia have found it time and time again, a magnificent burial mound, clearly once sealed with great reverence, that has been carefully, almost surgically, opened centuries after the burial. A neat tunnel dug directly into the central chamber. The Norse had a word for this, hogbrett, or mound breaking. What drove them to commit such a profound taboo? The simplest answer, of course, is greed. These mounds were whispered to be full of treasure, gold arm rings, silver brooches, and masterfully crafted swords. Imagine knowing that just beneath that silent hill, a king's ransom in silver lay waiting, guarded only by a dead man's spirit, for a later generation, perhaps one facing famine or poverty. The temptation might have been too great to resist. This was grave robbing, plain and simple, a high-risk, high-reward gamble against the undead. But the sagas tell a different, stranger story. They speak of heroes who broke into mounds not for gold, but for something far more valuable, ancestral power. The most common reason given for hogbrett was to retrieve a legendary weapon, usually a sword, from the grave of a famous ancestor. A sword like that wasn't just steel. It was said to hold the family's luck, its strength, its very spirit, the hamingja. To take up your great-grandfather's blade was to wield the power of your entire lineage. This was not seen as theft. It was a heroic quest, but you didn't just walk in and take it. In these stories, the hero would have to physically fight the mound's guardian, the Draugr, the restless spirit of the ancestor himself. You had to prove you were worthy of the blade by defeating the ghost of the man who once carried it. It was the ultimate test of courage and legitimacy. And there was another, darker motive, politics. Imagine a new chieftain rises to power. To secure his rule, he might break into the tomb of the founder of a rival clan by plundering the grave. He wasn't just stealing treasure, he was stealing their spiritual legitimacy. He was severing their connection to their ancestors and the land itself. It was a political and magical act of total domination. So, was it greed, honor, or power? The archaeological evidence is silent. An empty grave cannot tell us the motive of the person who opened it, But the careful way these mounds were entered suggests something more than a clumsy smash and grab. It hints at ritual, at purpose, at a story far more complex than simple theft. The line between a grave robber and a hero was thin, depending entirely on who was telling the story. But no grave tells a more complex story of power, mystery, and legacy than that of the Oseberg ship, where the dead themselves presented a riddle that we are still trying to solve today. Section 17, The Oseberg Ship, A Queen's Final Voyage. In the year 1904, on a quiet farm near the Oslofjord in Norway, a farmer began to dig into a large, strange hill on his land. It didn't look natural. It felt intentional, as his shovel cut through the turf and into the deep blue clay beneath. He unearthed something that would take the world's breath away. Not gold, not stone, but the dark, elegant curve of a ship's timber. He had found a ghost ship, a time capsule from the Viking Age, perfectly preserved for over 1,000 years. This was the Oseberg ship, and its discovery would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the power, art, and rituals of the North. This was no rough-hewn warship. It was an elegant vessel of oak, over 70 feet long, likely a royal barge used for coastal journeys. Its prow and stern rose from the earth like mythical beasts, covered in breathtakingly intricate carvings, swirling, interlacing animals gripping, biting, and weaving into one another in a style so complex it seemed to move. This was not a tool of war. It was a floating palace, a masterpiece of art and engineering. And it was a tomb, on the deck of the ship. A burial chamber had been built. Though ancient grave robbers had broken into the mound centuries ago, stealing precious metals, what they left behind was an even greater treasure, an almost complete picture of a royal Viking life. Archaeologists found elaborately carved wooden sleighs, a magnificent four-wheeled cart, beds, chests, kitchenware, weaving looms, and fragments of silk tapestries that depicted epic scenes. It was an entire household, packed and ready for the afterlife. But the greatest mystery was not in the treasures, it was in the bones. Inside the chamber lay the remains of not one, but two women. The first was an older woman, perhaps in her 70s or 80s. Her bones showed she had suffered from illness, possibly cancer, and had lived a life of high status. Her teeth were well cared for, and she had used a metal toothpick, an unheard-of luxury. This was almost certainly a queen, a powerful matriarch, or a revered priestess. Beside her lay a younger woman, around 50 years old. Her bones were healthier. The immediate assumption was that she was a servant, a thrall, sacrificed to accompany her mistress into the next world, just as the sagas described. For decades, this was the accepted story, a queen and her faithful servant, together in death. But modern science has given us a new, more confusing chapter. Analysis of their remains suggests that both women ate a diet rich in meat, the diet of the elite. A servant would have eaten mostly fish. So, who was this second woman? Were they sisters? A queen and her equally powerful vulva. Did the younger woman die of natural causes and was buried with her companion as an equal, not a sacrifice? The Oseberg ship gave us the most spectacular glimpse into the Viking world we have ever seen. It gave us art, treasure, and a magnificent vessel that still feels alive. But it also left us with a silent riddle. Two women, laid to rest together, their stories intertwined, their true relationship sealed in the earth. Their bones tell a story of power. But it's a saga we still don't know how to read fully. And they were not the only ones whose afterlife beliefs remained shrouded in mist. Section 18. The Forgotten Afterlives. More than just gods. The grand halls of the gods' Valhalla with its feasting warriors, Folkvanger with its peaceful meadows, and the gray, misty plains of Helheim dominate the stories we tell. But the Viking spiritual world was a vast and wild place, filled with other, more intimate afterlives, ones that didn't always require a warrior's death or a god's explicit invitation. We've spoken of the burial mound, the Draugr, as a home for the dead. But for many, it was more than that. It was an active, living part of the family's world. The ancestor within wasn't just sleeping. They were watching. They were a guardian spirit, a source of the family's luck and prosperity. The living would come to the mound to make offerings, a practice known as blot. They would leave food, pour ale onto the earth, and speak to the one buried within, asking for guidance or a bountiful harvest. Your great-grandfather wasn't in some distant heaven. He was right there, in that silent green hill overlooking the farm. You didn't just pray to him, you spoke with him. In some parts of the Viking world, particularly in Iceland, certain families had their own private heaven. They believed that, when they died, they would go to a nearby Helgafjell, a holy mountain. It wasn't a place of gods or epic battles. It was a beautiful, peaceful mountain where the dead lived on in a community of their own ancestors. They would feast, talk, and live a life much like their earthly one, but free from pain and sorrow. The living sometimes claimed to see fires lit on the mountain at night, a sign that the dead were welcoming a newly arrived soul into their hall. It was a comforting, local, and deeply personal afterlife, reserved not for heroes, but for family. But what about those who died at sea? The sailors, the fishermen, the raiders whose ships were swallowed by a storm. They did not go to Valhalla or hell. Their souls belonged to the water. They were taken by the sea giantess, Ran, and her husband, Draugr. She was said to catch the drowned in a great net and pull them down to her hall at the bottom of the ocean. It was a cold, mysterious, and watery realm. To die at sea was to belong to the sea forever, a fate both feared and respected by a people whose lives were so intimately tied to the waves. And finally, there was a whisper of another belief, one less common, but powerful nonetheless, the idea of reincarnation. The sagas sometimes hint that a powerful soul, instead of traveling to another realm, might be reborn into its own bloodline. When a child was born who looked or acted just like a famous ancestor, and was given that ancestor's name, it was believed that a part of the old soul had returned, a flicker of the old fire kindled in a new life. So the Viking map of the afterlife was not one of simple choices between a glorious hall and a gloomy underworld. It was a landscape of possibilities, a home within the earth, a hall upon a holy mountain, a kingdom beneath the waves, or a quiet return to the world of the living. These beliefs, these destinations, were anchored not just in myth, but in the land itself. The mounds, the mountains, they became permanent features, shaping not just the spiritual world, but the very ground the living walked upon. Section 19. The Legacy in the Landscape. Reading the Mounds. The Vikings didn't just live in their landscape. They wrote their legacy upon it. They didn't use ink or papyrus for this story. They used stone and earth, and today, if you know how to look, you can still read their farewells, whispered from the silent hills and lonely standing stones that dot the Scandinavian countryside. Unlike their wooden longhouses, which rotted away and vanished into memory, their graves endured. The great burial mounds, the Draugr, became permanent features of the land for centuries. Sailors navigating the complex coastlines of Norway would use these man-made hills as landmarks. Farmers would plow their fields in the shadow of a mound that had been there longer than their own village. The landscape itself became a map of ancient power, a silent record of the families who had once ruled these valleys. As you walk through a field in rural Sweden or along a Norwegian fjord today, you might see a perfectly shaped hill that doesn't quite belong. Its slopes are too smooth, its placement too deliberate. That's not nature, that's a story, that's a king's grave. And it wasn't just mounds. In some places, you can find stone ships, great outlines of long ships made not of wood, but of massive standing stones, arranged in the shape of a vessel. These were often used for cremations, a symbolic ship for those who could not be buried in a real one. They are ghost ships, forever sailing on a sea of green grass. Nearby, a single, uncarved standing stone, a batastine, might mark the resting place of a simpler soul, a silent, minimalist monument that has weathered 1,000 winters. Long after the Viking Age ended and the old gods were forgotten, these places remain sacred and feared. Local folklore, passed down into the 19th and 20th centuries, still spoke of the little people or spirits vidir who lived inside the mounds. Farmers would leave offerings of milk or butter on the hills to ensure good luck, without even knowing they were honoring a Viking ancestor. But more often, the mounds were haunted. They were the homes of the Draugr. People wouldn't build their homes too close. They told stories of strange lights seen flickering over the mounds at night, or of eerie music heard on the wind. These weren't just ancient graves. They were living parts of the landscape, pulsing with a forgotten power. Even the names on the land remember them. A farm might be called Hogland Moundland. A local fjord might be named after a legendary king who was said to be buried in a great mound nearby. The memory is encoded in the geography itself. So, the Viking goodbye didn't just end with a burial. It reshaped the very earth, leaving behind a landscape of silent monuments, haunted hills, and forgotten kings. Each mound is a chapter, each stone a word. These rituals, from the humblest peasant grave to the grandest ship burial, tell us so much about their fears, their hopes, and their deep, enduring love for their lineage. But what does it all mean? What is the final whisper they left for us in the cold northern soil? Section 20. A final whisper. Why their goodbye matters. And so, we stand here, at the end of our journey, in a landscape of silent mounds and whispering seas. We've walked through the smoke of mythical pyres and into the cold, dark earth of a chieftain's tomb. We've seen the keys of a queen and the magic staff of a Seeress. We've heard the terrifying account of a stranger and felt the fear of the walking dead. The Viking goodbye was not one story, but 1,000. It was a complex ritual woven from threads of profound love and primal fear. The love for family that made them pack a grave with treasures, tools, and companions, ensuring their loved one would not be cold, or hungry, or lonely on the other side. And the fear of the unknown, the fear of the restless spirit, that made them seal tombs like prisons and whisper charms against the dark. Their farewells were not abstract, they were practical. They packed for a journey they truly believed their dead were taking. This wasn't just faith, it was a certainty that life, in some form, continued with all its needs, its comforts, and its dangers. In a way, their graves were the ultimate act of caring, a final provision for the road ahead. But most of all, their goodbyes were a refusal to be forgotten. A burial mound was a testament to a life lived, a declaration of power that reshaped the horizon. A ship burial was a story told to the sea and the sky. Even the simplest grave, marked by a single standing stone, was a whisper against the wind, saying, "I was here. Remember me." And in the end, isn't that what every goodbye is about? A desire to keep the memory of a person alive, to give them a safe passage, and to believe that they are not truly gone, but simply journeying on. The Viking farewell, in all its strange and sometimes terrifying beauty, tells us far more about how they lived than how they died. It speaks of a people who loved fiercely, feared deeply, and believed utterly in the enduring power of family, land, and legacy. Their stories are now put to rest, buried in the earth, waiting for dreams just like yours. So sleep now. The mounds are quiet, the seas are calm. The past is sleeping beside you. Sleep well,